I would consider the place I grew up to be reasonably safe. However, just like nearly everywhere else, there was a bad part of town. I was by no means horribly poor, but I had 7 siblings, and as we grew into our teenage years, we were old enough to go out and do things, but sending us all to the mall or to see a movie just didn't quite fit into the budget. As a result, my siblings and I would often just walk around town. It was rather old, and everything in it seemed so fragile and beautiful, and it fascinated me so much when I was younger that I always begged my brothers and sisters to take walks with me. I was the youngest, so my mom said I had to have one of the big kids with me because it wasn't safe. Eventually they got sick of seeing the same things over and over, and one by one they stopped going with me. By the time I was 14, only 2 of my siblings remained at home. Only having to support 3 kids took a load off the budget, so my 2 siblings refused to walk with me more often in favor of doing things that cost money. I begged my parents to let me walk by myself, claiming that I was old enough and that I wouldn't go too far, etc. They allowed me, so long as I stayed within a certain radius of our neighborhood. However, at 14, I was sure I was all grown up, and decided to go further than my parents allowed. Though I didn't get tired of the same route I always took when I went on walks, I thought it would be fun to change things up. I wandered around for a while admiring my little town. As this was in the early 2000s, it was less common for kids to have phones, and I didn't. I was a little out of sorts having not been on that side of town much, but I had passed through it on my way to friends' houses and such. I wanted to leave myself enough time to get home before dark, so I decided to stop by a Pizza Hut that I had been to once or twice to see if someone had the time. As I walked towards the restaurant, I got a sort of prickly feeling, and that's when I started to realize I was on the wrong side of the tracks. I wasn't too concerned though. Our town was pretty clean cut, and even the bad side of town wasn't all that bad. I popped into the Pizza Hut, and the lady behind the counter happily told me the time. It was a quick exchange, and I was out in seconds. It was late enough that I knew I had better head home, but early enough that I could dawdle and still be home easily before dark. So I left the pizza shop, hearing the bell on the door jingle as it fell shut behind me, only to hear it jingle again as the door reopened. I was standing on the sidewalk waiting for a break in traffic so I could cross, when the person who had left behind me stepped up to my side. I thought nothing of it, figuring he just needed to cross as well. I glanced over at him, giving him a smile, just trying to be friendly. He, however, took this as an invite to strike up a conversation. "Hello," he said. I muttered hi in response, right as there was a break in traffic. I stepped into the street, and so did the man. Again, my naive self just figured we were walking the same way. "You look just like my daughter," he said. By now, I thought he was a bit weird, but not threatening. He looked about my parents' age and was dressed fairly nicely. Still, I didn't particularly want to talk to the man, so I just replied, "Oh." He smiled and said something along the lines of, "You're very tall and pretty, just like her." I nodded in response and just stared ahead as he was starting to give me the creeps. Then he said something that sent me over the edge. "You also have beautiful long hair, just like her." And with that, he reached out a large hand and sort of petted my hair. That's when I realized that this guy was bad news. I sped up a bit, but he quickened his pace to match mine. Once again, I didn't respond. He kept making comments about my hair, then about my face, then about my body. They got more and more creepy each time. I finally got to an area that looked familiar, and I knew I was only about 15 minutes from home. However, the man was still right next to me, and his comments had gone from innocent ones about similarities to his daughter to creepier ones like how my body had a nice shape. By now I was totally panicking, but I thought that if I ran, he would grab me. I was just down the road from my home, my plan being to scream and run for the door last minute when he made the creepiest comments of all, which I can still hear word for word in his voice as though it's drilled into my head. I bet a sweet girl like you has a tasty little treat hiding in those panties of hers. With those sickening words, I screamed Bloody Mary and ran like hell up my front porch steps and straight to my parents' room. By the time I got out, what had happened, and my dad had driven around the block to make sure the creep had left, my brother had called the police, and they were on their way. I filed a report, but never found the guy. I had nightmares for weeks, and it wasn't until my 3rd year of high school that I was willing to walk further than a block away from my house, alone.
This happened a bit over a week ago, and I feel like the first, bigger shock and paranoia has settled. So, I want to share what happened with me. I'll begin my story with a little explanation about how my building is designed, so that information is quite essential to understanding the story. I've included 3 pictures to help explain. If it matters, I'm a female who's 21 years old. So, I live in a medium-sized town nearby the center area, but still in a somewhat quiet neighborhood. My building basically has elders and family people living there, but hence the location, the main doors are always locked, so you either need to have a key or have somebody buzz you in. Once you enter the building, there's a staircase, and at each mid-floor, there are these small balconies. I live on the 3rd floor, and you can see directly into my bedroom from the balcony, which is located on the 2nd floor. I'll explain one more thing before beginning with the juicy stuff. My building is also located behind a big school, so I usually don't close my curtains as there's nothing but a big empty parking lot in front of the building at night. A lot of people wouldn't be wandering around it anyway. Now, let's get into the actual experience. It was the night between Wednesday and Thursday, and I didn't have work the next day, so I was watching YouTube on my tablet in my bed. I hear some noise coming from the hallway, kind of heavy footsteps with the sound of someone occasionally bumping into the handrail, as if drunk or extremely tired. But that's nothing very unusual, as I live in a building with other people living in it, so you do hear noises even at night. The part where it gets weird is when I heard the footsteps end on my floor. The bedroom wall, and the side of my bed where my head is located against a wall where the staircase is on the other side of. So it was clear that the person had stopped. I don't hear any doors opening, nor footsteps anymore. Just silence. I found it kind of disturbing that someone was just standing in the hallway in the middle of the night. After a while of silence, I heard the footsteps again, but this time more quiet and gentle. Starting to walk back down on the stairs, I just thought maybe someone was drunk and entered the wrong staircase or something. Not a big deal. They're gone now. I continued my YouTube marathon for a while before getting kinda sleepy. One thing I enjoy before going to bed is looking out of my window. There's one main road located at the end of the big parking lot, so sometimes I just watch cars passing before I go to sleep. So I put on some music with quiet volume and began my session. During the second song, I noticed a small source of light and some movement in the down left corner of my eyes. I lowered my gaze and froze. There was a man on the small balcony staring at me for who knows how long. in my bedroom, in just my t-shirt and underwear. After what felt like a few minutes of being frozen in shock, I quickly closed the blinds and went to check that both of my apartment doors were locked and closed. After a while of being afraid in my bed, I came to the realization that the man staring at me was most likely the source of the footsteps. He perhaps heard the sound of someone being awake in my apartment and listened to that for a while. Then he noticed the balcony and decided to check it out. I'm not completely sure, but I think he could have possibly seen me before I even went to look outside of the window, as I had a small light on in my room and it was relatively dark outside and I had no curtains on. If he didn't see me before, though, he sure as hell did when I was standing at that window. At that point, the feeling of discomfort and being creeped out without knowing, my thought process was stopped by the sound of someone trying to open my door. Luckily, my door is quite secure, so I didn't think this person would be able to get it open. And that's when I noticed the small letter box being opened as slowly and as quietly as possible. I still feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I think about this. I have 2 doors, thank God, so he couldn't see directly into my apartment, but I could hear him. He was sort of breathing heavy, constantly swallowing as if he was either nervous or just somehow disturbed. I think I held my breath and changed into a motionless wax figure until he closed the letterbox and for some reason sprinted down the stairs, making a lot of noise this time. I was so fixated on each sound, so I heard the sound of the hallway door being opened, and I assume he ran out. I didn't dare to look out of the window to check, as I was still feeling watched. Nothing more happened that night, but I was certain of getting no sleep for the rest of it. I called up my mom and explained what happened, and she had work the next day, so I didn't want to disturb her by asking her to come pick me up. So we agreed to keep the phone line open. I drank 2 energy drinks. Not such a good idea when your pulse rate is already sky high, and I stayed up until light was out. I fell asleep unwillingly. I haven't seen the man anymore, at least up until this moment, and I hope to never see him again. But what did happen has made me even more paranoid. The next time I had work after the incident was on Monday morning. I hadn't really been sleeping well and had an early morning. I was already somewhat all over the place, but this scarred me for life. As I explained before, I have 2 doors in my apartment, and as I was leaving for work, I opened up the outer door, and to my surprise, I saw the outer one slightly cracked open. I felt like throwing up and running into my mom's arms like a little girl, just to go somewhere safe, but instead I had to go to work. The rest of the day I kept looking over my shoulder, constantly having this weird feeling that someone will come to get me, like someone was watching me. Just not a good state of mind. I hadn't heard anything at night, so I'm assuming I was just exhausted from not sleeping properly. I'm so thankful for having 2 doors because however he managed to ever so quietly open that outer door, he could have entered my apartment where I was basically passed out and done anything to me. I reported these 2 incidents to the building's management and we filed a police report. They promised to have someone guard the premises for a while until the situation settles down. I'm sleeping at my mother's house and hoping that once I return, I'll be safe and be rid of the paranoia. I won't be keeping my windows open or checking the curtains for a while.
One day when I was 10 years old, I got a letter in the mail. I loved that someone sent me snail mail. I opened it all excited, and it was a drawing I'd done in school for a class exercise of a flamenco dancer, and then thrown it in the bin at school because I didn't like it. On the bottom was a simple sentence: "You're a talented little girl." I was naive and liked the compliment, but I showed the letter to my mom, who called my teacher. Then I remembered she was a bit concerned about where it had come from and left it at that. Later she said she was scared because my teacher didn't send it and didn't know who would. A few weeks later, I was alone at home, a very rare occurrence, when I noticed someone twisting the doorknob. Only a person who had a key could open it. So of course it didn't open, and someone slipped a letter through the crack underneath. I was a bit afraid of the way the letter had been delivered. My dad came home and opened it afterwards. This time, it was a letter talking about how someone was going to gift me a new tennis racket, which I played as a kid because I was so good at the game. At first, my parents thought it was one of their friends wishing me a belated birthday and promising a gift. But it wasn't. Now they were getting uncomfortable. About 5 more letters came after this over the course of 3 months. One was even about my taste in books. They talked about how proud they were that I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. They were, on the face of it, pretty benign letters full of congratulations and pride, but creepily worded and anonymously delivered. I got my first phone around this time because I played a lot of tournaments and my parents weren't available for all of them. Then the phone calls started. Sometimes it was static, sometimes breathing, sometimes a low laughter, and sometimes he would just say hi again and again and again. I always blocked the numbers, and they always came back. The numbers changed, but I recognized the area code, which remained the same. My parents were so concerned that they stopped my tournaments, hired a guard to stay outside of our house at all times, and called to check in with me every other hour. If I ever missed a call, they would send someone from one of their offices to check on me. Another week went by like this, and then they noticed a small hatchback doing drive-bys of our house every morning, like really early, 5 a.m. most days. I don't know why they never took down a plate number. Now my parents called the police and talked at length with them, but nothing came of it because there was no substantial anti-stalking laws in the country. My brother and I were on high alert from then on. We hired a full-time guard, full-time help at home. My mom got cameras installed outside. My dad talked to our neighbors and explained the situation so they were always careful too. Both my parents worked for the government, so they had a lot more authority and resources than others to keep us safe. When the landline got frequent phone calls, my dad got up and took one of the calls. He told him calmly to stop what he was doing, and the man responded by apparently letting out a deafening screech and hanging up. Shaken up, my dad decided to put an end to this. He took all of the letters to a private facility to have them fingerprinted. They found several prints. My dad then took the prints to the police and had them run it. My dad, keep in mind, was in charge of police administration. He was never a police officer, only in charge of oversight, in my city at the time, and no one asked any questions. The prints belonged to my aunt's husband, compared with his voter ID. Now let me give you a little background about him. My aunt, my mother's sister, who were very close and still are, was married to a man who was a schizophrenic. I only just found out about this a few months ago after my 18th birthday. This was an arranged marriage sort of deal where the parents of the bride and groom sort of put it together. I mean, it was the 60s in India, and they got along fairly well, and it was all good. In time, they even had a daughter, who I'm very close to even today. The thing is, though now I live in the US, these events took place in India. The mental health scene was not great there. People with mental illnesses, and particularly ones like schizophrenia, where everyone knows something's not quite right, were shunned. They were talked about in hushed whispers, often locked away in rooms and physically cared for but emotionally forgotten. Apparently, after my aunt and uncle were married, the first symptoms of the disease, which ran in his family, began manifesting. My aunt, who I loved dearly, wasn't exactly thrilled with it though. There was a prevailing feeling that the parents of the groom had tried to dupe our family by not revealing that the illness ran in their family. But here's where I was truly horrified. My grandparents and aunt thought in desperation they should abandon him on the streets because there was so much stigma associated with the mentally ill. Now, before you judge harshly, know that during his episodes, he would violently abuse my aunt, my cousin's sister, even their little dog. He would become a monster. Now, of course, that's no excuse, and their whole attitude was incredibly uneducated. But my mother, who worked with mentally ill and homeless at the time, stepped in and chastised them for their plans. She made sure to take him to a psychiatrist, get meds and therapy. This all happened before I was even born, and by the time I was born, he was doing fine. However, whenever I was at their house, I would try and avoid him because he always had this weird smile. I know it was his meds that caused him to space out and smile blandly a lot, but through my whole childhood he still made me feel uncomfortable. And because of what I thought were unreasonable feelings, I suppressed my discomfort and would even scold myself mentally for being so mean and thinking these terrible thoughts about an innocent person. But apparently, he started flushing his medications down the toilet the year I turned 10, and he'd then become obsessed with me for some reason. That's why the drive-bys were at 5 a.m. He would do them when my aunt thought he was at the gym. That's why he knew our address, my phone number, and had access to plenty of my pictures from my aunt and others in my family. He was family. He followed me to the point of going through my school's trash. I, of course, have just recently been told all of this. What I actually remember of these events is that my parents were suddenly a lot more cautious about where I went and what I did. At that time, I even thought it was annoying. He had several of my pictures pinned up in a closet, but because they were mixed in with my brothers and cousins, no one really questioned it. I mean, it's only natural to love your family.
This is a story of one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had. It was especially disturbing considering my age at the time of this encounter, with someone who was most likely a pedophile with bad intentions. I'm from Canada and generally feel very safe where I live. However, I live less than a block away from the homes of the two most notorious serial killers in Canadian history, Robert Pickton and Clifford Olson. Knowing that, it's safe to say there's a history of crime where I live. And just because two horrible people were put in jail for a long time, that doesn't mean evil is non-existent, as I learned. So here's how it all happened. After leaving my friend's house in the wintertime, around 10 o'clock at night, I slowly made my way home, walking through the dark, empty streets of our peaceful neighborhood. Her parents weren't very responsible and were too drunk to drive me home, but to be honest, I wanted to walk because I didn't want to go home right away. My parents trusted me and never would have thought that I could be in danger. I just turned 11 and was wearing pink little sneakers, my brother's hoodie, with my blonde hair in braids. I walked calmly and proudly, dragging along my brother's scooter beside me. I would keep telling myself there's nothing to be afraid of. I didn't look it, but I felt I was a pretty fearless little girl. I thought that I was tough back then, and nothing would sound cooler to my friends than telling them I walked all the way home by myself at night. Since I wasn't in any rush to get home and be told by my mother to go to bed, I paused and admired the silence. I took a deep breath, and when I exhaled, I created fog with it. After a while, I picked up my pace and continued towards my street. Through the fog, I could almost see where I had to turn onto my street. The peaceful moment was suddenly disturbed by the sound of a pickup truck driving past me, definitely above the speed limit. About a minute later, I heard a slow-moving vehicle's engine behind me, but I didn't think anything of it at first. Until I turned around. Strangely, this was the same red pickup truck that had driven past me a minute ago. It would have had to have gone all the way around the block to end up behind me again. Uncomfortably, I gripped my brother's scooter tightly and put one of my feet onto it. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, so I didn't get on it right away. I felt the truck getting closer, approaching me from behind. Then my stomach began to turn and I got chills. I had an intense gut feeling that I needed to get away from this man who was lurking behind me. I didn't look behind me again. I jumped on the scooter and raced to my street, my feet slapping the ground as I launched myself. The wheels slid a little bit on the frosty pavement while I rode off. I panicked, screaming a little bit every time the scooter wobbled. I picked up quite a bit of speed, my eyes watering from the freezing cold as the wind blew furiously into my face. My stomach lurched when I heard an engine roar. He stepped on the gas and sped towards me. The fear that I had been followed had now been confirmed. Tears fell from my eyes as I flew down the street like a bullet. Luckily, I could now see my house. Slightly relieved, I prepared to jump off and sprint inside. I looked over to him to see him right beside me, staring at me. It was difficult to see what he looked like, other than he had a beard and was wearing a hat, but I'll never forget his eyes. They stared at me in the most horrifying way. I had to turn away. I couldn't look at him. It was unbearable. Now at my front walkway, I slammed on the brakes, skidding on the icy road as I was thrown off the scooter. I frantically tossed it in my front yard and bolted. I let out a gigantic scream as I sprinted towards my door. Luckily, it was unlocked, so I ran inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it immediately. Screaming for my parents, I ran down to them so fast, I practically fell down the stairs. I tried to tell them everything that happened, but I was breathing so heavily they could barely understand me. Finally, they figured out what was happening and went upstairs with me. When we looked out the window, the red pickup truck was still in front of my house. My parents went outside to confront the driver, but as soon as he saw them, he sped off faster than he did when he was chasing me. I'm happy to say I never saw that man or his creepy red pickup truck ever again, but this encounter sure kept me awake at night, wondering what would have happened if I wasn't fast enough.
I would consider the place I grew up to be reasonably safe. However, just like nearly everywhere else, there was a bad part of town. I was by no means horribly poor, but I had 7 siblings, and as we grew into our teenage years, we were old enough to go out and do things, but sending us all to the mall or to see a movie just didn't quite fit into the budget. As a result, my siblings and I would often just walk around town. It was rather old, and everything in it seemed so fragile and beautiful, and it fascinated me so much when I was younger that I always begged my brothers and sisters to take walks with me. I was the youngest, so my mom said I had to have one of the big kids with me because it wasn't safe. Eventually they got sick of seeing the same early 2000s. It was less common for kids to have phones, and I didn't. I was a little out of sorts, having not been on that side of town much, but I had passed through it on my way to friends' houses and such. I wanted to leave myself enough time to get home before dark, so I decided to stop by a Pizza Hut that I had been to once or twice to see if someone had the time. As I walked towards the restaurant, I got a sort of prickly feeling, and that's when I started to realize I was on the wrong side of the tracks. I wasn't too concerned though. Our town was pretty clean cut, and even the bad side of town wasn't all that bad. I popped into the Pizza Hut, and the lady behind the counter happily told me the time. It was a quick exchange, and I was out in seconds. It was late enough that I knew I had better head home, but early looking the same way. "You look just like my daughter," he said. By now, I thought he was a bit weird, but not threatening. He looked about my parents' age and was dressed fairly nicely. Still, I didn't particularly want to talk to the man, so I just replied, "Oh." He smiled and said something along the lines of, "You're very tall and pretty, just like her." I nodded in response and just stared ahead as he was starting to give me the creeps. Then he said something that sent me over the edge. "You also have beautiful long hair, just like her." And with that, he reached out a large hand and sort of petted my hair. That's enough that I could dawdle and still be home easily before dark. So I left the pizza shop, hearing the bell on the door jingle as it fell shut behind me, only to hear it jingle again as the door reopened. I was standing on the sidewalk waiting for a break in traffic so I could cross, when the person who had left behind me stepped up to my side. I thought nothing of it, figuring he just needed to cross as well. I glanced over at him, giving him a smile, just trying to be friendly. He, however, took this as an invite to strike up a conversation. "Hello," he said. I muttered hi in response, right as there was a break in traffic. I stepped into the street, and so did the man. Again, my naive self just figured we were walking things over and over, and one by one they stopped going with me. By the time I was 14, only 2 of my siblings remained at home. Only having to support 3 kids took a load off the budget, so my 2 siblings refused to walk with me more often in favor of doing things that cost money. I begged my parents to let me walk by myself, claiming that I was old enough and that I wouldn't go too far, etc. They allowed me, so long as I stayed within a certain radius of our neighborhood. However, at 14, I was sure I was all grown up, and decided to go further than my parents allowed. Though I didn't get tired of the same route I always took when I went on walks, I thought it would be fun to change things up. I wandered around for a while admiring my little town, as this was in the